Well, it really is great to be here. What we're going to be looking at tonight is the question of whether the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony. And I want to be presenting some old and some new evidence that the Gospels are indeed based on eyewitness testimony. But I want to begin with a fellow Brit, C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, who made an argument about the person of Jesus. And he said that when we look at the sort of claims that Jesus makes about who he is, we either need to say that he is the Lord, that he is liar, or he is lunatic, because the sort of claims he makes are so big they can't just be written off as the words of a very great person, because a great person doesn't attribute so much to himself. But what we found is that in recent years people have added to those three possibilities another one, that Jesus is in fact legend. So we want to ask the question, do we have evidence that the Gospels are reliable? I want to go to a skeptical source. Bart Ehrman, one of the most famous, prominent skeptics within the US at the moment, a very accomplished biblical scholar, says this when he talks about the Gospels. What do you suppose happened to the stories about Jesus over the years as they were told and retold? Not as disinterested news stories reported by eyewitnesses, but as propaganda meant to convert people to faith, told by people who had heard them fifth or sixth or 19th hand. Did you or your kids ever play the telephone game at a party? Well, the telephone game in Britain we call Chinese whispers. You're probably not allowed to call that over here, but that's what we call it over there, and no one minds. Now, you know the way the telephone game works. It's a game specially set up in order to corrupt the message so you can laugh. So there are various rules. For instance, you have to whisper. That ensures the message gets corrupted. You're only allowed to say it once, so that ensures the message gets corrupted. You're only allowed to hear it from one person. Why should I use that as an analogy for how Christianity spread early on? I prefer the analogy of karate. Now, have you ever heard anyone say that karate must be becoming corrupted because it's being taught from one person to another? No, because you know that karate is full of discipline, and when people teach things, they teach it carefully. There are checks and balances to make sure it gets passed on. I think that's a far better analogy. But we're going to come back to this question of whether it's possible that Christianity could have begun something like the telephone game. But the first thing we're going to do is look at where the Gospels were written. Now, the Gospels, according to earliest Christian traditions there are about where they were written, generally weren't written in the land of origin, which is Israel and Palestine. I'm not making a political point when I use either of those words. I'm just talking about a location, okay? Now, according to early Christian tradition, Mark was written in Rome, Luke in Antioch, or maybe Achaia, or maybe Rome. John was written in Ephesus, Turkey, Asia Minor. A late Christian tradition, 300 or 400 years after Christianity began, was that Matthew's Gospel had been written in Judea. In other words, the general consensus is that most of the Gospels weren't written in Israel. We go to a modern scholar, a reasonably skeptical scholar, and he looks at the Gospels and he says, well, I think that none of them were written in that land of Israel or Palestine. Maybe John's Gospel began as a team effort with some group who were there in Palestine and then or Syria, and then they moved to Asia Minor. But other than that, basically outside the land. Or we could go to Bart Ehrman himself. He says, where then did these anonymous Greek-speaking authors live? Living probably outside Palestine, some 35 to 65 years after the events that they narrate get their information. The Gospel writers, he thinks, were probably outside the land. So we've got a consensus, whether it's a skeptical scholar or early church tradition, that most of the Gospels were written outside the land of the events that they narrate. Now that's an interesting thing, because that raises a question as to how familiar they were with the land that they're talking about. So we could ask, do they know the land? Do they know the agriculture? Do they know the architecture, the botany? Do they know the burial practices we could look into? All those sorts of things of culture. If you've never visited a place, how can you write about it intelligently? So we're going to look at a number of tests tonight to see whether these people knew about the land. Because that will tell us whether they are potentially close to the events. If they're thousands of miles away in another country, simply making things up, well, they're not going to have any of that right sort of information. I'd never been to your beautiful state before about 3 years ago, and I just didn't know much about it. I heard about Texas. I didn't know it could rain here, like really seriously rain. And that was completely new to me. So in other words, when you haven't been to a place, even in the information age, often you're quite surprised by something when you go there. Well, think about it back then when you don't have the internet. You know, back then it was even before Wikipedia. Can you believe that? And so how would someone making up a story about a country they'd never visited and they'd never met anyone who'd visited there know to write the right things? Well, I think we're going to find tonight that the Gospels are remarkably accurate, given that they're written such a long way away. And the particular test I'm going to spend most of our time on tonight are simply what people are called in the Gospels. Then we're going to look at a couple more tests after that. The test, do they call people the right thing? Well, do we have anyone here called Michael tonight? Any Mikes? Do you want to put your hand up? We've got a Mike here, yeah? Another Mike? Now, I expected there would be some Michaels here. Do you know why? Because we can say that back in the 1970s, 1 in 25 males born in the US was a Michael. That was a very common name. Back then, Jacob wasn't such a common name, but now you change and you look how over from 1967 to 1997, Jacob multiplies by a factor of about 100. So what we can say is names change in frequency over time. And it's not just now, back then they did, although probably not quite as quickly as they do now. So we could ask the question, did the Gospel writers give the people the right names? Imagine you had to write a story about people in France 100 years ago. Would you be able to give people the right sort of name? Well, you know, Jacques is a French name. You might know some other French names. Would you be able to get them in the right proportion and frequency? Or for any other country, for that matter? Would you even be able to do it about your own state? The sort of names that people had 100 years ago. Well, people have been able to study personal names recently using archaeology. And there's been a study of about 3,000 names that people were called back then. And we can say that Jewish names in the land of Palestine were different from Jewish names elsewhere, and yet the Gospels and Acts are probably written elsewhere, and yet they've got the right sort of names. That's the remarkable thing we're going to find. They've got the right pattern of names. Let's put some more flesh on that. The argument began with a researcher in Germany, but it's a list simply of all the names that people were called at the time, and so you can go through and get the information. Then along comes a British researcher, and he says, well, let's look at that and correlate that with the Gospels and see if there's any tie-up between what people were called outside the New Testament and what they're called inside the New Testament. And what we find is something rather remarkable. It's a very small chart here, not everyone will be able to see. But basically the most common name inside the New Testament for males, Palestinian Jewish males, is Simon. It's the top name for the New Testament, top name for Josephus, who's a historian of the first century, a Jewish historian, top name in the bone boxes that they had, the ossuaries, and it's the second top name in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We take the second name in the New Testament. It's Joseph, the second most common name, second most common also in Josephus and in the bone boxes. It's the most common one in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see a significant correlation. Looking at it another way, take the two top Palestinian Jewish male names together and you find nearly 16% of men were called one of those two names. Inside the New Testament is 18%. We go and take the top 9 men's names together, and we find outside the New Testament 41%, inside the New Testament 40%. That is incredibly close, and that is statistically significant because we're using a bigger data sample. As the data sample gets bigger, the numbers get closer. Now let's remember, this is a pattern that's showing up over 4 different writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, writing 5 different books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and Acts. And what we could say also is those Gospels, those writings, reflect that sort of name pattern individually as well, although obviously the statistics are not quite so great. You don't have such a big sample. With women's names, there's not such a big data sample, but we can say there's a broad correlation. The top woman's name outside the New Testament, Mary. Top woman's name inside the New Testament, Mary. You can say they have less imagination about what to call women, but nearly 29% of women were called one of those top 2 names, 50% one of the top 9 names, and that correlates pretty well with the 40% and 61% you get for those same things inside the New Testament. Bit more variation because the data sample's smaller. So we can look then at the ranks of names, and we can say, look at Jewish males in Palestine, and we could say these are the ranks of the names we've got in the New Testament. And then we could say let's go to another country where there are lots of Jews in Egypt, and we find a different pattern of names. Now that's a remarkable thing. Now I've got a question here tonight, and it won't work in the overflow, but at least I can find out from people here in the chapel. Does anyone here know anyone called Sabbathias? No? No? No one? Anyone? Pappus? Ptolemaeus? No? Dog? Not even a pet? No? Okay. Why not? Because the Gospels weren't written about Jewish men in Egypt. If they'd been written about Jewish men in Egypt, sure, those names would have become quite common for us, but they haven't. So in other words, if someone's in a different land, you get a different set of names. Now think about that again. If you had to make up that story about, people in France 100 years ago, would you have got the right sort of names? If you had to write a story about people in Egypt 100 years ago, would you get the right sort of names? You might have some vague idea of Arab names, but would you know how the names in Egypt differ from the names in Jordan, differ from the names in Syria? Unless you've been in those countries, you'd have no idea. And even if you have lived in those countries, I'm not sure your intuitions as to what the most common names would be a very reliable guide. Now again, we've got another survey. We've got some surveys tonight. And one of the surveys I've got is this. Has anyone had the experience of naming a child, giving that child what they thought was an unusual name, only to find out as soon as they've named the child that lots of other children have got the same name? Okay? So we've got at least one here, we've got another one here, another one there, another one there. Yeah, okay. That's right. Why is that? Because our intuitions as to what the most common names aren't always completely reliable. So that's something that's quite common because our intuitions are just based on a smaller data sample. So even if people were making up stories in the land, they wouldn't be able to get the names in the right proportion. Back then they didn't have any of those magazines that told you what the most common names were. So what we find is this is a remarkable thing. But the story goes on. You see, it's not just that they have the right proportion of names, they have the right features of names. You see, what happens if you call out Simon? Well, there are lots of Simons, aren't there? So then we've got to do what Wikipedia calls disambiguation. You've got to distinguish one Simon from another Simon. And you find that's what they do in the New Testament. Jesus had 2 of his 12 disciples called Simon. One was Simon with an extra bit, Peter or Cephas. One was Simon with an extra bit, the Zealot or the Canaanite. So you've got a disambiguation. And then you read other disambiguations. Jesus went and had a meal with someone called Simon the leper, but he wasn't a leper at the time because people were sitting around having a meal with him. Maybe Jesus had healed him. Simon of Cyrene carried the cross. There were lots of Simons around, so you better distinguish this one. Simon Peter in the book of Acts stayed with someone called Simon the tanner or the leather worker. So you find they distinguish them. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph. So you find that they make sure that these most common names are distinguished and not the less common names. It could be adding a father's name, a job, a hometown. It doesn't matter, but you've got to do something to set them apart. Now, how could someone making up stories outside the land do that? Now, I've got another survey. Anyone here find it difficult to remember names? We got 2 honest people, 3 honest people, 4. Anyone else? Come on, come on. No, don't be shy. Any more people honest? No, raise hands, please. You find it difficult to remember names? Okay, yeah. Now, I've forgotten so many names since I arrived here yesterday, and I have been witness to 5 name-forgetting events from other people, where they've said, I cannot remember this person, but I could tell you all sorts of things about them. You could say what car they drive, you could say how many family members they've got, you could say what state they used to live in, you know, everything. You could say about them except that vital piece of information you need in the social setting to introduce them. I bet you tonight, you're going to have, some of you are going to have that situation. Yeah? It's going to, and it may already be happening. You're looking around, you're thinking, that person over there, I really know their name. You know, it's just on the tip of my tongue, but it's just slipped me for a moment. I know, yeah, we had a daughter stay in our house for a month. But, you know, what is it? You know, names just are so forgettable. Why is it? Because usually there is no logical connection between a name and the person. So there's no logical reason for that person to have that name. And there's lots of logical reasons why that person shouldn't have that name sometimes. So that's why we forget names. We remember things about people, but names are amongst the hardest things to remember. Stories are easy to remember, names are hard to remember. Which means that you can watch a film, and you watch a film and you remember what everyone does, you remember what the minor characters do. Do you remember the minor characters' names? No. Do you even remember the major characters' names? Not always. You go away on holiday and you meet some people who are really interesting and you come back and you tell your friends about them, but you might even just drop out the names of these interesting people because the really interesting thing is to tell the story. So what we find is that names are one of those forgettable things that can just drop out very easily. So think about this. If the Gospels have correctly got the detail that's the hardest sort of thing to remember, isn't there every reason to think they could get the other things right? The story bits, the who was with whom, where they went, what they did, that's easy compared with getting names right. But we're finding that they get the names right. And that, to me, suggests that we're not getting these stories 5th or 6th or 19th hand. Because if it had happened 19th hand or even 5th hand, you wouldn't get the names right. It wouldn't be happening regularly. So that just won't explain it. The only way we can get this pattern is if we have not just eyewitness testimony, but high quality eyewitness testimony. That's what we've got going on. Now I want to take this idea a little bit further. Now you've all heard, I'm sure, about apocryphal gospels, and people have said, hey, what about having some other gospels in the Bible? Well, let's just look at how they do on other names. So the Gospel of Thomas, one of the most popular ones that people talk about. And you look at how does it do with Palestinian Jewish names? You know, not very well. The main character is called Didymus Judas Thomas, which means twin, Judas twin, which is just not the sort of name people were called back then. You could look at another gospel, the Gospel of Mary. It doesn't even call Jesus Jesus, it just calls him the Saviour. And it's, which Mary? We have no idea. And then you've got the Gospel of Judas, which was published recently, and it's got 2 Palestinian Jewish names. You know, Jesus and Judas. And then it's got a whole load of people from outer space. So that, to me, is not very impressive. I don't look at it and think, wow, didn't they know the time and place really well? We could take it a bit further. Let's look at the names in Matthew. Take the list of the 12 disciples in Matthew. We find a remarkable correlation between the list of names here and statistics that have just been found in the last 10 years. I have put in brackets next to a name the rank of that name for Palestinian Jewish males if it is in the top 99 names. And what we find is if it's one of the more common names, it has a qualifier. If it's not one of the more common names, it does not have a qualifier. Let's go through the list. So, Simon, rank number 1, qualifier, called Peter, and Andrew, not ranked, his brother. So Andrew's just given with reference to Simon. James, high ranking, 11. The son of Zebedee, and John, rank 5, his brother. Philip, low ranking, 61st equal, no qualifier. Bartholomew, 50th equal, low ranking, no qualifier. Thomas, not even in the top 99, low ranking, no qualifier. And Matthew, high up, rank number 9, qualifier, the tax collector. James, high ranking, 11th, the son of Alphaeus. And Thaddeus, 39th equal, low ranking, no qualifier. Simon, rank number 1, the Cananean. Judas, ranked number 4, Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, I know there are other things going on with that list as well. But the point is this. These statistics have only been known since 2003. You see? And what we're finding is a correlation between that list of ancient names and statistics that have only been known recently. That's a remarkable thing, because it says to me that what we've got in this list is a list from Palestine. It's a list that's formed in the land. If it were made up outside the land, they would have different names. Very soon, the gospel, the apostles weren't known by those original names. Peter just simply became known as Peter, not Simon with the extra bit Peter. The names actually develop a little bit because they become more distinctive when they get outside the land. But back when we see this list, it's got exactly the right pattern for the time and place. But it doesn't just work with lists, it also works with dialogue. Now, one of the things about the name John is it's actually quite a common name, ranked number 5. So when Herod wants to say about Jesus that he thinks he's John the Baptist, come back from the dead, he cannot simply say to his servants, this is John, because his servants would have said, which John? We've got several Johns that work in the palace, that it doesn't really help us. So he says, this is John the Baptist. Then the narrator continues, so Herod sees John. Now the narrator doesn't need to give a further qualification because the narrative makes it quite clear which John we're talking about. The narrator goes on, and so John said. But when Herodias' daughter wants the head of John the Baptist, she can't just say, give me John's head. She might have got the head of the wrong John. So she says, give me the head of John the Baptist. Yeah? And then the narrator immediately continues, and so he sent and beheaded John. Now you see the way it's distinguishing the way the narrator speaks from the way the characters in the narrative speak. Now that, of course, could be just a really clever literary device to make the narrative look authentic. But the cleverer you make the gospel writers, the harder it is to say they got it wrong through incompetence. Okay? So just bear that trade-off in mind. And what I can say is this is exactly the way people would have had to have spoken back then. So this could be part of evidence that what we've really got is a report of how people spoke. Now let's consider the principal character in the Gospels. You know the main person in the Gospels? I'm not going to say his name for a moment. You know who I mean, okay? Now we're going to look at what that character is called. Is he called the right thing? What's he called in the narrative? What's he called by other characters? And what does he call himself? Those are our questions. Let's start with what he's called in the narrative. And we begin with looking at a number of different Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And we got Thomas and Judas in there. All with the main name for the main character being Jesus. The Gospel of Philip, which has become popular. It's quite a late thing, you know, maybe 150 years, 200 years after the events, which has something about a relationship, although the text is quite broken, which people get really interested about broken text because they can make up the bits in between. And it's got something about a relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, so that actually got quoted in the Da Vinci Code. And that just calls the main character Christ. That's the main title. The Gospel of Peter calls him Lord, the Gospel of Mary, the Saviour. And the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Mary don't even call the main character Jesus at all. Now to me that looks like a sort of later development where the name Jesus has basically dropped down. That's the way I look at it. We could then look at the occurrences of the name Jesus in the 4 Gospels. And we see there on the left-hand 4 columns the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, with John having by far the most occurrences of the name Jesus. But we can see that some other Gospels, like Thomas, also have the name Jesus, but Peter and Mary don't at all. What was the founder of Christianity called in non-Christian accounts? Well, Tacitus, writing about the fire in Rome in the year 64, he said that the founder of Christianity was called Christ, Christus in Latin. Pliny, writing to the emperor about the year 112, about Christians, by the way they're called Christians, Christ, that name really took off, calls the founder of Christianity Christus, okay, Christ. Josephus, a Jewish writer, shows a bit more knowledge and says he's Jesus with the extra bit Christ to distinguish him. So in other words, the name that predominates through the non-Christian